My name is David Vance. I'm 68 years old, and I thought I understood the geology of a human heart. I was wrong. A few months ago, my only son Ethan took me on a camping trip deep into Yellowstone National Park. He drove me to a remote clearing, looked me in the eye and said, "Bye, go meet a grizzly bear," and left me for dead. But when he returned to my home ready to claim his inheritance, I was already there sitting in my armchair waiting for him. And I had a surprise of my own. Before I tell you what that surprise was and how it changed everything, please take a moment to let me know in the comments where you're listening from in the world. And if you believe that true strength is found not in avoiding storms, but in surviving them, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. The silence in Yellowstone isn't really silent. It's a language you have to learn. It's the whisper of wind through lodgepole pines, the distant bugle of an elk, the soft crunch of earth under your boots. I was trying to teach this language to my son Ethan. We were standing over a topographic map spread across the hood of his ridiculously oversized SUV, the kind that had never seen a speck of real mud until today. I pointed a steady finger at the tightly clustered contour lines. "You see this?" I said, my voice filled with an old enthusiasm. "This indicates a steep incline, a ridge. The glaciers carved this valley out, but they left this behind. It's like a backbone." Ethan grunted, his eyes fixed on the phone in his hand. The screen cast a pale, artificial light on his face, a face that seemed to grow more unfamiliar to me each year. "Uh-huh. Cool, Dad." He wasn't listening. His thumb was swiping furiously, endlessly. Even from a few feet away, I could hear the faint, insistent pings of notifications arriving one after another. He had that look on his face, the one I'd come to recognize, a tight jaw, a subtle furrow in his brow. It was the look of a man running from something, a look I first saw when his first startup went under, and then again when his second one followed suit. I folded the map, the crisp paper making a sound that felt ancient compared to the electronic chime of his phone. "If you don't pay attention to the land," I said softly, "it has a way of surprising you." He finally looked up, his eyes briefly meeting mine. There was no curiosity in them, only impatience. "I've got GPS, Dad. It's fine." He shoved the phone in his pocket. "Let's get the fire going. It's getting cold." He turned and walked toward the campsite, leaving me alone with the map and the quiet language of the mountains. A language he had no interest in learning. I knew then that this trip wasn't about the wilderness. It was about something he wanted. And the wilderness was just a boardroom he had chosen for the negotiation. Later, as flames from the campfire danced and threw flickering shadows against the trees, Ethan finally began to talk. He spoke of his mother, my late Emily, with a rehearsed fondness that felt like a tool he was using. "Mom would have loved this," he said, staring into the fire. "Just the two of us out here, connecting." I simply nodded, my heart aching with her memory. Emily had been the buffer between us, the gentle translator of my quiet ways and Ethan's loud ambitions. She had also been a worrier. "He spends money like water, David," she'd once told me late at night in the kitchen. "He thinks success is a destination you can buy a ticket for, not a trail you have to walk." She had been right. Ethan let the silence sit for a moment, before he continued, his tone shifting to one of feigned concern. "I've been worried about you, Dad. All alone in that big house." He poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. "We need to start thinking about the future. Your future." The conversation steered, as I suspected it would, toward finances. He asked about the house, about my portfolio, about the life insurance policy Emily and I had taken out decades ago. He wrapped his questions in the language of love and duty, but underneath I could hear the cold calculus of a man assessing assets. He spoke of his own business, a new tech venture, with a frantic, bright-eyed optimism that didn't quite mask the desperation. He was painting a picture of a glorious future, and I was beginning to realize he expected me to pay for the canvas. I gave him non-committal answers, vague assurances that I was fine, that everything was taken care of. I wanted to believe he was just concerned. Hope is a stubborn thing, even when you know better. As the fire burned down to glowing embers and the vast, star-dusted Wyoming sky opened up above us, Ethan made his move. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it into my lap. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. "Just some paperwork, Dad," he said, his voice casual, almost bored. "For you to look over. It's just some standard stuff, a power of attorney. You know, to make it easier for me to handle things for you if I ever need to. Bills, accounts, stuff like that. Just to make sure you're protected." I picked up the folder. It felt heavier than it should. The air, which had been crisp and clean, suddenly felt thick, hard to breathe. I didn't need to open it completely. I could see the headings on the top pages, words typed in a cold, official font that felt alien in this wild place. Durable power of attorney, fiduciary responsibilities, asset transfer agreement. These weren't the words of a son offering to help pay bills. These were the words of a corporate takeover. My son wasn't here to connect with me. He was here to acquire me. I closed the folder, my fingers tracing its sharp edges. I looked at Ethan, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the fire. His expression was neutral, waiting. "My reading glasses are in the tent," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the cold dread that was creeping up my spine. "It's too dark out here. I'll take a look at it in the morning." Ethan just smiled, a thin, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure, Dad," he said. "Take your time. We've got all day tomorrow." But as I looked at him then, I had the distinct feeling that my time was running out. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The thin fabric of the tent was no barrier against the cold weight of my thoughts. The manila folder sat on the small camp table just outside, a pale rectangle in the moonlight, looking for all the world like an unexploded bomb. I imagined its contents, the cold legal phrases designed to strip a man of his life's work, of his very identity. When morning finally broke, painting the sky in shades of pale rose and gold, the air was crisp and clean, but the tension between us was thick enough to taste. Ethan was unnervingly cheerful. His smile was too wide, his movements too quick, as if he were a badly rehearsed actor playing the part of a dutiful son. He had coffee already brewed, and he handed me a mug with a flourish. "Big day today, Dad," he said, his voice booming a little too loudly in the quiet of the dawn. "I've got a surprise for you. A special spot. A viewpoint that's not on any of the tourist maps. The kind of place you have to earn." A part of me, the old part that still clung to the memory of the boy he used to be, wanted to believe him. But the geologist in me, the man who had spent a lifetime reading the landscape, knew that the most beautiful facades often hide the deepest faults. Still, I nodded. I had to see this through. I had to know what lay at the end of this trail he was so eager to lead me down. We left the campsite behind the SUV's engine, a low growl in the morning quiet. For the first 20 minutes, we followed the park's main loop road, passing signs for Old Faithful and the Grand Prismatic Spring. Then Ethan abruptly turned onto an unmarked gravel road, nearly hidden by a thick stand of aspens. The smooth pavement was gone, replaced by a jarring, bumpy track. "It's an old ranger access road," Ethan explained, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "Hardly anyone uses it anymore." The road grew narrower and rougher, the trees closing in on either side. I watched the familiar peaks of the Gallatin Range disappear behind us, replaced by a dense, anonymous forest. My internal compass was spinning, mapping our progress, noting every turn, every landmark. It was a habit born of a lifetime spent in the wild, but now it felt less like a habit and more like an instinct for survival. After another 10 minutes of jarring travel, the trail ended abruptly in a small, sun-dappled clearing. Ethan pulled the car to a stop. The engine cut out, and the silence that rushed in was absolute. We were well and truly nowhere. He got out of the car, and I followed, my boots sinking slightly into the soft pine needles that carpeted the ground. There was no grand vista, no spectacular hidden viewpoint. There was only a cramped clearing, walled in by a dense circle of lodgepole pines, a silent green cage. The sky was a small, perfect circle of blue directly above us. It felt like being at the bottom of a well. The beauty was gone, replaced by a chilling sense of isolation. This place hadn't been chosen for its view. It had been chosen for its remoteness. Ethan didn't bother with any more pretense. He walked to the passenger side, opened the door, and retrieved the manila folder. He strode back to me, his face a hard mask of impatience. He thrust the folder and a pen at me. "Summers. Okay, Dad. Let's get this done. Sign it." He didn't ask, he commanded. His voice was flat, stripped of all the false warmth from the night before. This was the real Ethan. The CEO giving an order. The predator who was tired of stalking his prey. I didn't take the folder. I just looked at him, my gaze steady. "I read it last night, Ethan," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the profound silence of the clearing, it sounded as loud as a gunshot. I saw a flicker of surprise, then annoyance in his eyes. He hadn't counted on that. He had counted on my trust, on my failing eyesight, on my supposed ignorance of such matters. "This isn't a simple power of attorney to help me with bills." I continued, stating it as a geological fact, an observation of the layers beneath the surface. "It's a full and immediate transfer of assets. The house, the investment portfolio, Emily's legacy, everything. It's all in there on page 4, section 3. For a moment, he was speechless. The carefully constructed reality he had built for this trip shattered. Then the rage came. It was a sudden volcanic eruption. "You're being difficult," he spat, his voice rising. "You're always so damn difficult. Why do you have to analyze everything to death?" He started pacing, a caged animal in our green prison, waving the folder in the air. "It's for your own good. It's to protect the family assets." "My assets, Ethan," I corrected him gently. "Not the family's. Mine." That was the spark that lit the fuse. His face turned crimson, and the words came pouring out, a torrent of resentment and entitlement that had clearly been building for years. "I'm drowning, Dad. Do you get that? I'm drowning." He was shouting now, his voice echoing slightly off the silent trees. "My company is on the line. I have investors breathing down my neck. I'm about to lose everything." He stepped closer, jabbing a finger in my direction. "And you're sitting on a fortune, just sitting on it. What's the point of you having all that money? When your own son is failing, it's your duty to help me. It is your responsibility as my father." The final words were a shriek, raw and ugly. In that moment, I wasn't his father. I was just an obstacle, a vault he couldn't crack. The boy I had taught to fish and read a compass was gone, replaced by this desperate, furious stranger. The pressure had been building for years, and here at the bottom of this well, the fault line had finally ruptured. My voice didn't waver. "No, Ethan. I will not sign away my life's work to fund your mistakes." For a single terrifying moment, I saw something break in his eyes. The frantic anger collapsed into a void, something colder and far more dangerous. He didn't say another word. He lunged, but not at me. He lunged at the small day pack on my shoulder, the one containing my compass, my emergency rations, my flint and steel. The tools of a man who respects the wilderness. He ripped it from my shoulder with a violent tug. Before I could react, he spun and threw it with all his might. I watched it arc through the air, a dark green canvas blur, before it disappeared deep into the dense, impenetrable woods. He walked back to the pack he had thrown on the ground, pulled the single bottle of water from its side pocket, and tossed it at my feet. It landed in the dirt with a soft thud. He then walked to his car, got in, and the sound of the door slamming shut echoed like a gunshot in the clearing. He rolled down the window, his face a mask of cold indifference. "Then you can stay here and think about it," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He put the car in reverse, the tires crunching on the gravel. He paused for a moment, looking at me one last time, a stranger looking at a problem he was about to solve. "Good luck," he added, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. Bye, go meet a grizzly bear. He hit the accelerator. The SUV kicked up a cloud of dust and pine needles, and then it was gone, its engine noise swallowed by the immense waiting quiet. The silence that returned was no longer a language. It was a verdict. For a long time, I just stood there. The dust kicked up by the SUV settled around me, and the silence of the clearing became absolute. The shock was a physical thing, a cold wave that washed through me, leaving my limbs feeling heavy, my thoughts slow. My son had just tried to kill me. He hadn't used a weapon. He had used the wilderness itself. The betrayal was so immense, so monstrous, that my mind couldn't fully grasp it. It was like trying to comprehend a geologic age. But as the minutes stretched on, the shock began to recede, and two other emotions took its place, rising like magma from a deep and dormant place. First came the grief, a sorrow so profound, it felt like the cracking of bedrock in my soul. The son I had raised, the boy I had loved, was truly gone, lost to a stranger, consumed by greed. And then came the anger. It was a cold, quiet anger, the anger of a mountain that has been stripped bare. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was a hardening, a sharpening of the senses. The grief was for the father I used to be. The anger was for the man I needed to become to survive. My name is David Vance, I thought to myself, my first clear thought in what felt like an eternity. And I am not going to die here. The geologist took over. The father was put away for safekeeping. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford when you have nothing. I did what I had always done when faced with an unknown landscape. I stopped. I breathed. And I observed. I checked my pockets. A wallet, keys to a car, and a home hundreds of miles away, and a simple pocket knife. That was it. I looked at the bottle of water at my feet. 1 liter, maybe 2 pounds of life. I unscrewed the cap and took a small measured sip, not a gulp. Discipline. That was the first rule. Next, I looked up through the circle of trees at the sky. The sun was high, just past its zenith. My shadow was short, pointing slightly northeast. That meant it was early afternoon, and that direction was roughly west. I knew this quadrant of Yellowstone from my old survey days. I knew that about 15, maybe 20 miles almost due to west was the Wapiti Lake Ranger Station. It was a long walk, but it was a known point in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unknown. It was my true north. The plan formed with a quiet clarity. Follow the sun west, find water, do not stop moving until dark. I started walking, leaving the clearing, my son's chosen crime scene, behind me. My pace was slow, deliberate. I wasn't a young man anymore, and I couldn't afford to waste a single calorie of energy on haste. My mind, which had been a storm of pain and confusion, became a quiet, focused instrument. I wasn't thinking about Ethan anymore. I was thinking about drainage patterns, game trails, and the subtle language of the trees. After an hour of walking through the dense pine forest, I stopped to listen. I could hear it. A faint, almost imperceptible murmur. The sound of moving water. I adjusted my course, moving toward the sound. I looked for signs. The pines began to give way to more aspens and willows trees that liked their feet wet. I saw a deer trail the tracks sharp in a patch of mud heading in the same direction. Animals always know where to find water. 10 minutes later, I broke through a thicket of bushes and saw it. A small, clear creek tumbling over moss-covered rocks. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. I knelt down, splashed the cold water on my face, and refilled my bottle. I followed the creek, letting it guide me westward. The sun was my compass, the water was my lifeline. I spent my whole life reading the history of the earth, in layers of stone, learning to see the story of millennia in the curve of a valley. I could read the land. But I had failed, I realized with a pang of that deep bedrock grief, to read the layers of deceit in my own son. He had seen me as an old man, a relic, a resource to be liquidated. He had never seen this man. The man who knew that a southern-facing slope held the most warmth, that the inner bark of a pine tree was edible, that a man could walk for a long, long time on a cold stream and a cold rage. Ethan's gravest mistake was not in leaving me to die. It was in forgetting who I was. The pain in my heart was a dull, steady ache, but the earth beneath my feet was solid and real. And the earth had never lied to me. I would trust the earth. The sun was touching the tops of the western peaks when I saw it. A thin gray tendril of wood smoke rising against the deep purple of the evening sky. Hope is a powerful fuel. It sent a fresh surge of energy through my exhausted body. 20 minutes later, I stumbled out of the tree line and saw the Wapiti Lake Ranger Station. It was a simple log cabin, solid and unassuming, with a warm yellow light glowing in its single window. To me, it looked like a palace. My legs were screaming in protest, my face was scratched from branches, and my lips were cracked from dehydration, but I had made it. I had walked out of the wilderness my son had chosen as my tomb. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, and the scent of coffee and burning pine filled the air. A woman looked up from a large topographical map spread across a wide wooden desk. She was in her 50s with a practical, no-nonsense haircut and eyes that looked like they could spot a lie from 100 yards away. She hadn't changed much in the 10 years since I'd retired. "Sarah," I said, my voice raspy, barely a whisper. Her head snapped up. Her eyes widened, first in confusion, then in utter shock. "David, what in God's name happened to you? You look like you've been through a war." She was on her feet in an instant, her chair scraping against the floorboards. She guided me to a chair, her expression a mixture of deep concern and professional assessment. "Water," I managed to say. "Please." She brought me a large glass and I drank it down without stopping. Then another. She didn't press me for details. She just waited, a silent, steady presence, until I was ready. And then the story came out. Not in a rush of emotion, but in a quiet, steady stream, like water finding its way through rock. I told her about the camping trip, Ethan's strange behavior, the folder of documents. As I spoke, I watched her face. The initial look of friendly concern sharpened into a focused, analytical intensity. She was no longer just my friend. She was a federal park ranger listening to a report. When I told her about the clearing, about the demand to sign everything over, her jaw tightened. And when I finally repeated Ethan's last words to me, "Bye, go meet a grizzly bear," I saw a flash of something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. A cold, hard fury. She was silent for a full minute after I finished, her gaze distant, as if she were replaying the entire event in her mind, plotting it on the map in her head. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me how sorry she was. The first words out of her mouth were quiet, precise, and carried the weight of the law. "That's a felony, David." I must have looked confused because she leaned forward, her hands flat on the desk. "This isn't just a horrible family dispute. What Ethan did is a federal crime. Willful endangerment and abandonment within the jurisdiction of a national park. He didn't just leave his father in the woods. He left a U.S. citizen in a life-threatening situation on federal land. The penalties for that are severe. Prison time. Significant fines." Hearing her put a name to it, a crime, a felony, changed something inside me. It took the shapeless personal pain of betrayal and gave it a hard, definite edge. It was no longer just a son's cruelty. It was an illegal act with real-world consequences. Sarah stood up and walked over to a radio console. "I'm going to make a few calls," she said, her voice now all business. "We need to log the incident, check the gate cameras for his vehicle's entry and exit times, and I'm sending a team to that clearing at first light to document the scene. His tire tracks, his footprints. Your son was arrogant, David. He was also sloppy. He left evidence." I looked at my hands. They were scratched and dirty, but they were steady. I had walked into this station as a victim a survivor seeking shelter. But sitting here listening to Sarah, I felt a fundamental shift. The geologist who had spent the day reading the land had been replaced by a man who was now beginning to see the map of his own future. It would not be a future of grief and victimhood. It would be a future of consequences. My son had used the wilderness to try and erase me. He had no idea that in doing so he had just handed me a mountain, and I was about to drop it on his life. While I sat there catching my breath and letting the reality of my new situation settle in, Sarah moved with the quiet efficiency of a person who deals with crises for a living. She was no longer just my friend offering comfort. She was an officer of the United States National Park Service, and a crime had been committed on her watch. She turned to her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced speed. Ethan drives a gray Ford Explorer, right new model. I nodded, amazed she remembered from his last brief visit years ago. He's not a man who likes to be forgotten, she muttered, her eyes scanning the screen. Okay, got him. Eastgate entry camera logged his plate at 8:14 yesterday morning. Just the one vehicle, 2 occupants visible. And here we go. Outbound log, same gate. 2:32 this afternoon, single occupant. She printed the time-stamped images. The pictures were grainy, but the story they told was crystal clear. 2 men went in, 1 man came out. She picked up the radio handset. Her voice was calm and professional, cutting through the static. Dispatch, this is Ranger Jenkins at Wapiti Lake Station. I'm authorizing a site survey and evidence collection for a potential felony endangerment case. I'm sending you the coordinates now. I need a team at first light. We're looking for tire tracks model-specific, footprints, disturbed ground, and I want them to sweep a 100-yard radius for a discarded green daypack. She listened for a moment, then replied, Affirmative. The subject is a person of interest, not a missing person. Treat it as a potential crime scene. Watching her work, I felt the last vestiges of my victimhood fall away. She was a professional using her tools to establish a set of facts. And I was a professional too. It was time to use mine. Sarah, I said, my voice stronger now. Could I use your phone? I need to make 2 calls. She pushed the station's landline phone across the desk, without a word, her eyes conveying a complete and total understanding. My first call was to Arthur Albright, my lawyer for the past 30 years. He was a man who operated with the same quiet precision as Sarah. His voice was gravelly with age when he answered. Arthur, it's David Vance. There was a pause. David, it's good to hear you. Is everything all right? I took a breath. Not exactly, Arthur. I'm safe. But there has been an incident involving Ethan. I need your help. It's urgent. I explained the situation in the most direct, unemotional terms I could manage. I told him about the documents, the abandonment, and my rescue. I could hear his sharp intake of breath over the line. Good heavens, David, he whispered. I'm not calling for sympathy, Arthur, I said. I'm calling for an instrument. I need you to draft a new estate plan, effective immediately. I want everything placed into a revocable living trust, the Vance Family Trust. I could hear him scribbling notes. And this trust needs a very specific clause, Arthur, a morality clause. I want it to state that any beneficiary who commits a criminal act against the trustee, that's me, is immediately and irrevocably disinherited. No appeals, no loopholes. Can you do that? The silence on the other end of the line was profound. Then I heard him say, David, that is the most brilliantly savage and legally sound thing I've ever heard. Consider it done. I'll have a draft emailed to you within the hour. My second call was to my financial advisor, a sharp young man named Peterson. The conversation was even shorter. Mr. Peterson, this is David Vance. I am authorizing my attorney, Arthur Albright, to make some immediate and significant changes to my portfolio. You are to give him your full and unconditional cooperation. We are restructuring everything. You will receive the details from his office shortly. Thank you. I hung up the phone. A sense of profound, cold calm settled over me. Ethan had tried to use the wild, unpredictable chaos of nature to destroy me. I would respond with the cold, unassailable, and utterly predictable logic of the law. He had left me with nothing but a bottle of water and a pocket knife. I was about to leave him with nothing but the consequences of his own actions. The trust wasn't just a legal document. It was a fortress built of clauses and paragraphs designed to stand long after I was gone. It was also a mirror one I was going to force my son to look into. Sarah finished her radio call and looked at me, giving a slight nod. "The team is confirmed. They'll have everything by morning." I nodded back. "Good," I said. "My lawyer will have everything by then, too." While I was making my calls, building a legal fortress brick by brick, Ethan was performing the first act of a carefully rehearsed play. Sarah shared the details with me later, compiled from the official Park Service report and the 911 call logs. Hearing it was like watching a film of an event I had already lived through from the other side of the camera. It was chilling. After he left me, he didn't speed away in a panic. The exit cameras showed his Explorer driving out of the park at a perfectly legal, leisurely pace. He was not a man fleeing a crime scene. He was a man heading home after a pleasant day trip. He likely turned on the radio, perhaps humming along to a song, his mind already calculating the timeline, calculating how long it would take for the wilderness to do its work. He would have called his wife Chloe once he had cell service. A short, simple message. "It's done." Then he would have driven home. He didn't call for help that day, of course. Panic would have been too honest. His grief needed to be aged, to be cultivated to make it believable. He needed to establish a period of plausible deniability. So he went home. I imagine him and Chloe having a quiet dinner, maybe opening a bottle of expensive wine. They wouldn't have celebrated, not outwardly. Theirs would have been a silent, shared understanding. A toast to a future that was finally within their grasp. It was the next morning, almost 24 hours after he abandoned me, that he made the call. His performance began. Sarah let me listen to the audio recording. The operator's voice is calm, professional. 911, what is your emergency? And then I hear my son's voice cracking with a perfectly engineered panic. My father, he says, his voice breaking. My father is missing. David Vance. He gives the operator our home address, his own name. He tells the lie he has spent a day perfecting. We were camping in Yellowstone. He got up in the middle of the night to use the restroom, and he never came back. I thought he'd just gone for a walk. He adds the masterful touch. I've been searching for him since dawn, calling his name. I didn't have any cell service. I had to drive for an hour just to get a signal. He lets out a sound that is supposed to be a sob. It is the most artificial sound I have ever heard. It was, as Sarah later said, a masterful performance. The work of a man who had been acting his entire life. He was no longer a perpetrator. He was a victim, a grieving son desperate for help. He hung up the phone, having laid the foundation of his perfect alibi. He was confident, certain that I was already gone, a tragic story to be told, a memory to be mourned for a respectable amount of time before the inheritance could be claimed. He believed he had planned for everything. The terrain, the wildlife, the cold of the night. He had accounted for every possibility except one. The possibility that I would simply refuse to die. Sarah gave me a set of her husband's old clothes that were a surprisingly good fit, a few $100s in cash, and a thermos of hot black coffee. There were no grand goodbyes. We were two professionals who had found a common purpose. You go set things right, David, she said, her handshake firm and strong. The Park Service has your back on this. She drove me out of Yellowstone under the cover of a pre-dawn darkness, taking the service roads to avoid the main gates. As we drove, I watched the silhouettes of the mountains I had just survived recede in the rearview mirror. They no longer looked like a threat. They looked like silent stone witnesses. The airport in Bozeman was a jolt to the system. After the profound quiet of the wilderness, The cacophony of rolling suitcases, garbled announcements, and echoing conversations felt like a physical assault. People rushed past me, their faces buried in their phones, their minds on flight delays and business meetings, each person wrapped in the bubble of their own ordinary life. I felt like a ghost moving among them, a man who had stepped out of one world and wasn't yet fully in another. I caught my reflection in a glass panel and saw a stranger looking back. He was an old man, yes, but the exhaustion in his eyes was undercut by a new hardness, a flinty resolve that hadn't been there 2 days ago. The flight was a blur of clouds and engine drone. I sat by the window looking down at the wrinkled map of the earth below a landscape I now understood with an intimacy that was both terrifying and empowering. In a few hours I was flying over a distance it had taken me a full day to walk. My plan, I realized, was doing the same. It was moving faster than Ethan could possibly imagine, closing a distance he didn't even know existed. I took a taxi from the airport. Driving through the familiar streets of my own city felt strange, like watching a movie of my life. There was my local library, the grocery store, the park where I used to push Ethan on the swings. They were all the same, but I was different. When the taxi pulled up to my house, I paid the driver and walked up the familiar stone path. I slid my key into the lock, a simple action I'd performed 1,000 times, but today it felt different. It was an act of reclamation. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was cool and dark and silent. It smelled of old books and my late wife's lingering scent of lavender. It smelled like home. This was my territory. This was the ground I would defend. My first act was to take a shower. I stood under the hot water for a long time, letting it wash away the dirt, the sweat, and the grime of the last 48 hours. But it felt like more than that. I was washing away the victim. I was washing away the helpless old man my son had left to die. The man who stepped out of the steam clean and renewed was someone else entirely. I put on a fresh pair of slacks and a crisp button-down shirt. I was not preparing for a family reunion. I was preparing for a board meeting where I was the chairman and a hostile takeover was about to be put down. In my study, I turned on my computer. The emails were waiting. One from Arthur with the finalized trust documents attached. Another from Sarah with her official report and the collection of digital evidence. The printer began its work, the quiet whirring the only sound in the house. One by one, the pages emerged, each one a nail in the coffin of my son's plans. The carefully worded text of the trust. The cold, damning language of the morality clause. The time-stamped photographs of his car entering and leaving the park. I gathered the papers, squared them into a neat pile, and walked into the living room. I placed them squarely in the center of the coffee table. Exhibit A. Exhibit B. Exhibit C. Then I sat down in my favorite armchair, the one that faced the front door. And I waited. The house was silent. But it was the silence of a held breath. The silence of a perfectly calibrated trap, waiting only for the sound of a key in the lock. I had been waiting for a little over 2 hours. It was nothing. After walking for a day through the unforgiving wilderness, after a lifetime of waiting for my son to become the man I hoped he would be, 2 hours was the blink of an eye. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked a steady rhythmic sound in the quiet house. The papers on the coffee table sat in their neat, ordered pile. The stage was set. Then I heard it. The familiar crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. A car door slammed, then another. Their voices were muffled at first, then grew clearer as they approached the front porch. I could hear Chloe's voice laced with a theatrical weariness. "I'm just so exhausted, Ethan. The stress of it all." Her voice was the sound of a crocodile weeping. "I know, honey," Ethan replied, his tone low and conspiratorial. "It's almost over. We just have to play our parts for a little while longer." The police called again. "The search is ongoing, but they're not hopeful. They said it's Grizzly country." He said the word Grizzly with a finality that made my blood run cold. He truly believed he had sent me to my death. The sound of a key sliding into the lock was unnaturally loud. The deadbolt turned with a heavy click. The front door swung inward, flooding the entryway with the fading light of the late afternoon. They stepped inside, Chloe leaning on Ethan's arm, the very picture of a grieving, supportive couple. They looked tired, yes, but underneath the performance I could see the smug satisfaction. The relief of a long and difficult task finally completed. They kicked off their shoes, their movements slow. Ethan tossed his jacket onto a chair. They hadn't seen me yet. I was sitting in the deeper shadows of the living room, a place the afternoon sun didn't quite reach. Chloe sighed and said, "I need a drink." "You deserve it," Ethan said, turning from the entryway. And then his eyes met mine. He froze. He froze so completely, it was as if his entire nervous system had shut down. He was a statue of a man caught mid-step. Chloe, noticing his stillness, turned her head to see what he was looking at. A small strangled gasp escaped her lips, and her hand flew to her mouth. The color drained from both of their faces. It was not a sudden change, but a slow, horrifying retreat of life, like watching the tide pull away from a shore, leaving behind a pale and desolate landscape. Ethan's keys, which he had been about to toss onto the side table, slipped from his numb fingers and clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor. The sound was like an explosion in the dead quiet of the room. They stared at me, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a primal rising fear. They were not looking at a father. They were looking at a ghost. I didn't move a muscle. I just watched them, letting the silence stretch until it was a physical weight in the air. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, quiet, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Hello, Ethan." "Hello, Chloe. You're letting the cold in. Close the door." For a moment they just stood there, paralyzed in the entryway. It was Ethan who finally moved almost mechanically, reaching back to push the front door shut. The click of the latch sounded like a cell door locking. The performance started immediately, a frantic and clumsy improvisation. "Dad," Ethan stammered, taking a hesitant step forward. His face was a mess of feigned relief and genuine panic. "Oh my God, you're all right. You're here. We were so worried. How did you get back?" "We just came from the sheriff's office," Chloe chimed in, her voice an octave too high. "We've been up all night, David. All night. Calling the park, calling the police. They were sending out search parties at dawn." She wrung her hands, a gesture so theatrical it was almost comical. "We drove all over looking for you." Ethan added, his lie gaining momentum. "We called your name until our throats were raw. There was no cell service, we couldn't call for help. We thought the worst." I said nothing. I just sat there in my armchair and watched them. I let the silence be my response. I watched the sweat bead on Ethan's forehead. I watched the way Chloe's eyes darted around the room, refusing to meet mine. It was a fascinating and pathetic display. Two people trying to build a fortress on a foundation of sand, while the tide was already washing it away from under them. Their story was full of holes, a poorly constructed narrative of concern and despair. It was so different from the cold, calculated lie Ethan had told the 911 operator. This was the sound of desperation. This was the sound of two rats trapped and squealing. They finally ran out of words, their frantic energy sputtering out into an awkward silence. They both looked at me, their faces a question, pleading with me to believe them, to absolve them, to make this nightmare go away. I let the silence hang for another 10 seconds, letting them stew in it. Then I moved. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into the pocket of my shirt. Their eyes followed my hand, as if it were a snake. I pulled out a small black digital voice recorder. It was sleek and modern. I placed it gently on the coffee table right beside the neat stack of papers. The soft click of plastic on wood was the only sound in the room. I looked at Ethan. I looked at Chloe. Then my eyes settled back on my son. My voice when I spoke was as calm and as cold as a mountain stream. That was quite a story, I said. I'd like you to tell it again, from the beginning. I paused, letting the words sink in, watching the last bit of hope drain from their faces. Then I delivered the final blow. Sarah Jenkins, the supervising ranger at Yellowstone National Park, is very interested in hearing it too. The name Sarah Jenkins landed in the silent room and detonated. Chloe let out a small wounded sound, like an animal stepping into a trap. Ethan's face, which had been a frantic mask of lies, went completely blank. The performer was gone, leaving only the terrified man underneath. He knew in that instant that the play was over. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet in the room was now my ally, and it was absolute. I gestured with my hand toward the neat stack of papers on the coffee table. "The surprise I told you I had," I said, my voice even. "It's for you." I reached forward and picked up the top document, a slim report of about 5 pages bound by a single staple. I slid it across the polished wood of the table toward them. "Let's begin with this," I said. "It's a preliminary field report from the United States Department of the Interior National Park Service, Yellowstone Division. You'll see it's signed at the bottom by Supervising Ranger Jenkins." Ethan stared at the official letterhead as if it were a venomous snake. I gave him a moment, then I pointed to the second page. "These are attachments, time-stamped photographs from the East Gate security cameras. This one shows your explorer entering the park yesterday morning. The imaging software confirms 2 occupants. And this one, I tapped the second photo, shows the same vehicle leaving yesterday afternoon. 1 occupant. I then unfolded the third page, a detailed topographic map of the park. A small remote area was circled in red. "And this is the location where your car was parked according to GPS data from another ranger's patrol log. The evidence collection team was very thorough this morning. They photographed the tire tracks, a perfect match for the brand you have on your SUV. They also found my footprints. And yours." I leaned back in my chair. "Ranger Jenkins asked me to inform you that willful endangerment and the abandonment of an individual within the boundaries of a national park is a federal crime, a felony." She said the typical recommended sentence, given the circumstances, is between 5 and 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Chloe began to weep, no longer acting, but making raw, ugly sounds of pure terror. Ethan just stared, his mouth slightly open, his mind clearly struggling to process the speed and totality of his destruction. I gave them no time to recover. I reached for the second, much thicker document. It was bound in a professional blue folder. I placed it on top of the first report. "This," I said, my voice unchanging, "is a legally certified copy of the Vance Family Revocable Living Trust executed and filed yesterday afternoon." I saw the confusion mix with the fear in Ethan's eyes. He knew about wills and inheritance, but this was something else. "Let me explain it in simple terms," I said. "As of yesterday, I, David Vance, no longer personally own anything. This house, the stocks and bonds, my financial advisor manages the savings accounts, every single asset is now owned by this legal entity. I am the sole trustee, which means I and only I have complete control over everything within it." They were now utterly lost, adrift in a sea of consequences they couldn't navigate. I opened the folder to a page that had been marked with a small yellow tab. I put on my reading glasses, a simple, deliberate act. I wanted them to see every part of this process. "But this is the section that directly concerns you, Ethan," I said. I cleared my throat and read the clause aloud, my voice slow and clear, each word a hammer blow. "Article 4, Section B, Morality Clause. Should any named beneficiary of this trust commit a criminal act against the person of the trustee, David Vance, or be found responsible for causing him willful physical or emotional harm, said beneficiary will be immediately, automatically, and irrevocably disinherited from this trust and all assets contained within for perpetuity. I finished reading and took off my glasses, placing them carefully on the table. I looked at my son. His face was ashen. He finally understood. I made it simple for him, connecting the pieces of his new reality. I tapped the Yellowstone report. "This is the documented criminal act," I said softly. Then I tapped the clause I had just read. "And that act has triggered this clause." I leaned forward one last time. "So you see, Ethan, it's over. And the most important part, the part I want you to understand completely, is that I'm not doing this to you. I'm not disinheriting you. You did this to yourself. You disinherited yourself with your own 2 hands the moment you shut that car door and drove away. All I have done," I said, gesturing to the papers that represented the end of his world, "is the paperwork to reflect the reality that you created." He didn't argue. He didn't rage. He didn't even look at me. My son just sat there, slumped on the edge of the sofa, his head in his hands. All the fight had gone out of him, draining away to leave behind something hollow and frail. Chloe's sobbing had subsided into quiet, hitched breaths. They were no longer monsters of greed and ambition. They were just 2 people at the end of a very wrong road. I felt no triumph, no rush of victory. I only felt the immense, crushing weight of a tragedy that had been decades in the making. I looked at Ethan, at the man who was my son, but was also a stranger. My voice was quiet when I spoke, not much more than a whisper. "You see, Ethan, the thing you don't understand is that I don't have to do anything now. There are no more decisions for me to make. You made them all for me." He looked up, then his eyes red-rimmed and full of a despair so complete it was difficult to look at. "You disinherited yourself," I continued softly. "The moment you closed that car door and told me to go meet a grizzly bear. Your criminal act triggered the clause in the trust. It's a closed loop, cause and effect, an action and a reaction. It's the simplest law of nature, and now it is the simplest law of this family. It's over." I let that finality settle in the room. Then I offered him the only thing I had left to give. Not forgiveness, but a choice. "The money is gone, Ethan. That is not negotiable. But I am giving you a choice about your future, about your freedom." I leaned forward, making sure he was listening. "Here's the choice. You and Chloe will walk out of this house tonight. You will go home, pack your things, and you will disappear from my life. For good. You will not call me, you will not email me, you will not try to contact me through anyone else. We will become strangers. If you agree to this, and if you honor it for the rest of your life, then this report from Yellowstone," I tapped the folder, "will remain my private property." I held his gaze. "But if you break that promise, if you ever try to contact me again, if I even see your car on this street, I will make one phone call to Ranger Jenkins. She will forward that file to the United States Attorney's Office. You will be investigated. You will be charged. And with this evidence, you will be convicted. You will go to a federal prison. So that is your choice. Silence and freedom, or contact and a cage." He stared at me, the terrible clarity of the choice dawning on him. There was really no choice at all. A tear slid down his cheek and he gave a small, broken nod. "Okay," he whispered. The word was so quiet I barely heard it. "Okay, Dad." I stood up, then the signal that our meeting and our relationship was over. "Good," I said. "Now get out of my house and leave your key on the table by the door." They didn't make a sound. Ethan simply stood up, his movements slow and heavy like a man moving underwater. Chloe followed, her face tear-streaked and empty, her eyes fixed on the floor. They walked to the front door, a slow funereal procession out of a life they had just lost. Ethan paused at the entryway table, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a single key on a worn leather fob. A key to this house, the key I had given him when he first went off to college, a symbol that he would always have a home to come back to. He placed it gently on the polished wood. The small metallic sound was the only goodbye I would ever get. He didn't look back. They opened the door, stepped out into the twilight, and closed it quietly behind them. I stood there for a long time watching through the window as their car pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. The only thing I felt was a profound and cavernous sadness. I walked through the quiet house, my footsteps echoing in the new emptiness. On the mantelpiece there was a photograph of a much younger Ethan, maybe 7 or 8 years old, grinning a gappy smile, his arm around his mother. Emily looked so happy. I picked up the frame, my thumb brushing against the glass. The truth was, I hadn't lost my son tonight. I had lost him years ago in small, imperceptible increments to an ambition that had hollowed him out and left a stranger in his place. Tonight, I had simply signed the death certificate. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of survival, an act of preservation. I had protected this house, this life, this legacy that Emily and I had built together. I had defended the memory of the happy boy in the photograph from the broken man who had just walked out my door. A sense of peace began to settle over me, quiet and deep. It was the peace of a mountain after the earthquake, scarred and changed, but still standing. The chaos was over. The boundaries were clear. My life was my own again. I went to the phone and dialed Sarah's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and alert. "David," she asked, "is it done?" "It's done," I said, my voice steady. There was a pause. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone softening with genuine concern. "I will be," I told her, and I knew it was the truth. "Sarah, I called to thank you for everything." "You don't need to thank me, David. You just needed a good map." I smiled, the first genuine smile in what felt like a lifetime. "Well, you gave me one. And I was wondering if I could come and visit you and your husband this weekend. I'd like to see that garden you're always talking about." "Of course, David. You're always welcome." "Good," I said, looking out the window at my own backyard, at the earth waiting for spring. I have a sudden urge to plant something, to put my hands in the soil and watch something grow. We said our goodbyes, and I hung up the phone. The house was silent, but it was a good silence now. The silence of a new beginning. My son had tried to bury me in the wilderness, but he had failed. He didn't understand that for a geologist, the earth is not a tomb. It is a foundation, and I was finally ready to build on it again. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength resides not in youthful arrogance, but in quiet competence and a lifetime of experience. It teaches us that underestimating the quiet and the elderly is a fool's error, for they often possess a resilience forged over decades. The most profound lesson is that protecting one's own dignity sometimes requires creating unshakable boundaries. Justice isn't always about loud revenge. It's about calmly and intelligently ensuring that people face the natural consequences of their own choices, reminding us that we are all the architects of our own downfall. If you believe that wisdom and resilience should never be underestimated, please like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below.